Odin Underseverders. Today's case begins in the late 19th century in a remote part of the United States Appalachians. Around 1880, a family of settlers established themselves in the mountains, in a valley naturally isolated by the terrain. Known as the Jackson family, they started with just 24 people who, seeking religious isolation, decided to sever all ties with the outside world. So 027, for the small group, Patriarch Joseph Jackson established strict rules. No contact with outsiders was permitted. Marriages were to occur only within the community itself, and leaving the valley was considered an unforgivable betrayal. What began as a quest for religious purity soon transformed into an involuntary genetic experiment. So $48, the community grew slowly over the first 30 years. Marriages between first cousins became common, and by the end of the first generation, the initial signs of genetic issues were already observable. Children exhibited mild malformations, learning difficulties, and a high rate of infant mortality. By the second generation, born around 1910, more serious problems were already present. CO1-diverted recessive genes, now duplicated due to marriages between close relatives, began to manifest more clearly. Children were born with congenital heart defects, extra digits, cleft palates, and mental retardation. The lack of adequate medical care and absolute isolation only worsened the situation. By the time of the third generation in the 1930s, the circumstances grew increasingly dire. CO140. By this time, practically every valley inhabitant shared a large portion of their genetic material. It was no longer simply cousins marrying. It was people who were simultaneously cousins, uncles, and nephews within a genetic web so intricate it was impossible to map precisely. The region's harsh climate, with severe winters that further isolated the community, reinforced the feeling that this small world was all that existed. Says Yorsu Soder de 209, children born during this period grew up believing their physical and mental conditions were normal, since nearly everyone around them displayed some type of deformity or limitation. The fourth generation, born around 1950, was marked by the emergence of a peculiar syndrome, locally known as the Jackson's mark. Children were born with a bluish skin tint, due to a rare genetic condition called methemoglobinemia, caused by an enzyme deficiency. Sazo 238. Additionally, severe facial malformations became common, featuring underdeveloped jaws, widely spaced eyes, and malformed ears. By the 1970s, the fifth generation showed alarming signs of genetic deterioration. Fertility dropped drastically while infant mortality reached terrifying levels of 60%. So L300's LU1's surviving children often could not speak or walk and presented malformations so severe some were barely recognizable as human. The case only came to light in 1983 when a 16-year-old girl, Mary Jackson, managed to escape the valley during a storm that damaged part of the fence surrounding the property. The Zo3Z1D Need, the story Mary told, seemed straight from a nightmare. Generations living in total isolation, forced marriages between close relatives, children born with ever-worsening deformities, all just a few dozen kilometers from civilization. Initially skeptical, the police organized an expedition to the valley, and what they found confirmed and exceeded Mary's account. 003D47, in the valley lived about 240 people, almost all with some degree of physical deformity or cognitive limitation. Authorities discovered the community had developed its own communication system, as many members could not articulate words properly. Living conditions were primitive, without electricity or running water, and many inhabitants had never seen a car or a television. Azuo Forsuadrilalender's health authorities who examined the community members were shocked by their findings. Many presented conditions doctors had only seen in textbooks, and some deformities were so rare they lacked official nomenclature. If you wish to follow more cases like this, ones that affect entire societies and reveal hidden truths, Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any investigation. CO 435, when authorities began investigating the Jackson case in February 1983, their first challenge was establishing each community member's identity. No one had official documents, and the naming system was as confused as the family tree itself. Many people shared the same names, typically honoring the community founders, making it nearly impossible to determine parenthood. 055,000ers. Investigators found the community kept rudimentary records, mainly in an ancient Bible, where births and deaths were noted. However, these records were inconsistent and often deliberately obscured to hide the true nature of relationships. Entries frequently omitted parents' names or used vague terms like child of the valley for offspring from particularly close unions. At 05 and 26, one of the first to cooperate was Martha Jackson, a woman of about 50 who, despite clear physical signs of consanguinity, retained enough cognitive ability to communicate coherently. Martha revealed that since childhood, she had been taught the outside world was dangerous and impure, and that only within the family could blood remain pure. Says 0552, marriages were decided by the Council of Elders, Martha reported. When a girl turned 13, the elders would meet and to decide which man would be her husband. No one questioned these decisions. Martha revealed she was simultaneously the cousin and aunt of her husband, and that her father was also her great-uncle. The investigation faced significant resistance from the community's older members. As 016 Winfinder, the elders, led by 70-year-old Ezekiel Jackson, who claimed to be the guardian of family tradition, refused to cooperate and insisted authorities had no right to interfere with their customs. "We have lived this way for generations," declared Ezekiel. "Pure blood has kept us strong against a corrupted world." This statement stood in stark contrast to the physical reality of the valley's inhabitants. CO 639, doctors examining the community identified a series of rare genetic conditions that had become common due to consanguinity. Appert syndrome, characterized by craniofacial malformations and fused fingers. Meckel syndrome, causing encephalocele 6 protrusion of the brain through the skull, and polydactyly, and various other conditions, each extremely rare in the general population. The 07-05. A particularly disturbing discovery was the so-called House of Special Children. It was an isolated cabin where children with the most severe deformities were kept, some chained to crude beds. These children, many of whom could not feed themselves or control basic bodily functions, received minimal care and, according to accounts, frequently died during winter. Says 0703 was. The investigation also revealed the community had developed its own mythology to explain the deformities. Children born with serious problems were considered, marked by God, as a test of faith. In some cases, specific deformities were interpreted as signs of spiritual power, and the most severely affected children were treated as oracles whose inarticulate sounds were interpreted as divine messages. As 0708, as the investigation progressed, researchers realized they faced an unprecedented case in modern medical literature. Never before had a community practicing systematic consanguinity for so many consecutive generations been documented. Geneticist Dr. Robert Keller, part of the investigation, described it as an involuntary genetic experiment revealing the extreme limits of what happens when a gene pool becomes critically reduced. So 0829, the investigation team faced another major obstacle: the lack of an adequate legal framework for the situation. Technically, consanguineous marriages were illegal in the state, but since no marriages had been officially registered, it was difficult to determine which laws had been broken. Furthermore, many originally responsible for implementing this practice were already deceased. Says 0853. A turning point came when researchers found evidence the community had not been completely isolated the entire time. Recovered documents indicated men occasionally made trips to nearby towns for essential supplies. More disturbingly, there were indications that occasionally women from outside were brought to the valley, usually against their will, in an attempt to renew the blood. As 090 tweeted Sarah Williams, a 62-year-old woman from a nearby town, recognized specific facial features in photographs shown by investigators. She revealed her younger sister had disappeared in 1952 at age 17 and was never seen again. "We always thought she'd run off to the big city," said Sarah. "We never imagined she could be so close, living a nightmare." The investigation also faced profound ethical dilemmas. How to proceed with community members who were both victims and perpetrators of the system. How to reintegrate people into society who had never been exposed to the modern world and often had significant cognitive limitations. And perhaps most crucially, how to deal with recently born children, many needing urgent medical intervention. Satan 04. While these complex questions were debated, investigators continued unraveling the Jackson community's history. Each discovery seemed more disturbing than the last, revealing layers of isolation, abuse, and genetic deterioration spanning more than a century. So 1031s in August 1983, 6 months into the investigation, a discovery fundamentally changed their understanding of the case. During an excavation near the community cemetery, remains of over 300 children were found, many with extreme bone deformities. Subsequent analysis showed these graves dated from different periods over the past 100 years, indicating the infant mortality rate was even higher than first suspected. C1101, forensic examination of the remains, revealed consistent patterns of malformations that worsened with each generation. The oldest graves contained skeletons with relatively mild anomalies, extra fingers or partial bone fusions. The more recent graves held extreme deformities, drastically malformed skulls, absent limbs, and cases of conjoined twins who had not survived birth. Z11N28 Dr. Elizabeth Norcross, a geneticist specializing in rare hereditary diseases, was called to analyze genetic data from living community members. Using advanced techniques for the time, she partially reconstructed the Jackson family tree. "What we found is unprecedented in medical literature," she declared. "The coefficient of consanguinity in the most recent generations exceeds anything ever documented in human populations. In some cases, we're talking about individuals who share over 70% of their genetic material, something theoretically impossible in a viable population." Dr. Norcross identified over 40 rare genetic conditions within the community, many normally occurring in less than 1 in 100,000 people. Most alarming was the discovery that some observed conditions were completely new to science. Unique combinations of genetic anomalies resulting from the interaction of multiple recessive mutations that would rarely have the chance to manifest together in a genetically diverse population. In C1244, in September 1983, the investigation took another surprising turn when one of the younger community members, 19-year-old Jacob Jackson, began cooperating extensively. Jacob, who had relatively mild facial deformities and preserved cognitive ability, revealed he had suspected for years something was wrong. So 1306, when I was a child, I found a basic biology book among supplies brought from town, he recounted. That's when I realized what they told us about being special and chosen wasn't true. We were sick, and our leaders knew it. Jacob revealed the existence of hidden documents kept by the elders, including newspaper clippings and even scientific articles on genetics and heredity. So 13731, they knew what they were causing, he stated. In private meetings, the elders discussed which marriages would produce fewer monsters, as they called them. It wasn't ignorance, it was deliberate control. This revelation transformed the investigation, introducing potential criminal aspects. If Jacob's claims were true, Community leaders had knowingly perpetuated harmful practices, condemning generations to suffering. So 1401, the investigation received another boost when scientists analyzed DNA from personal items of Joseph Jackson, the founder. The results were startling. Joseph already carried genes for several rare recessive conditions, including the methemoglobinemia that caused the bluish skin in his descendants. This finding suggested the decision to isolate and practice consanguinity may have been partly motivated by a desire to hide a pre-existing genetic condition. PUSA 1422's in October 19833, authorities made another disturbing find in a sealed basement of the main house, diaries kept by generations of Jackson women, recording in agonizing detail the births, deformities, and premature deaths. Written in a mix of archaic English and a community-developed dialect, they revealed not everyone had passively accepted the system. There were accounts of escape attempts, women trying to avoid pregnancy, and even merciful infanticides when children were born with deformities incompatible with life. So 15-12, one diary entry from 1937 contained a particularly moving passage. Today I gave birth to what should be my son, but God in his infinite cruelty transformed him into something I cannot recognize as human. His eyes are where his cheeks should be, with no sign of nose or mouth. He did not breathe, thanks to divine mercy. The elder says it is a test of our faith. But what kind of God tests his children this way? I begin to suspect it is not God who tests us, but the men who speak in his name. As these documents were translated, a more complex image emerged. This was not simply a uniformly fanatical group, but a hierarchical social structure where a male elite maintained absolute control through religious indoctrination and physical isolation. 1609, leave in the comments. Never give up on truth. If you believe all missing persons deserve to be found, all victims deserve justice, and all closed communities need to be investigated. The 1631's in November 1983, after 9 months of intense investigation, authorities decided to intervene definitively. The operation, involving medical teams, social workers, psychologists, and police, was carefully planned to minimize trauma for a population with no significant outside contact. The 237 surviving members were evacuated and temporarily housed in adapted facilities at a state hospital. 1651 there, each underwent complete medical evaluations, confirming the devastating extent of damage from generations of consanguinity. The results were alarming. 98% of members had some genetic condition associated with consanguinity. Among children under 10, 100% had multiple conditions, many requiring immediate intervention. The 17 ET of Dr. James Harlow, medical team coordinator, declared, "In my 35 years of practice, I have never seen so many rare conditions concentrated in one group. We are essentially witnessing the final result of a genetic experiment no ethics committee would ever allow." Authorities faced unprecedented legal and ethical questions, with no official records of birth, marriage, or death. Legal identities had to be created from scratch. For children, this meant birth certificates with often only estimated ages. The issue of criminal responsibility was complex. Investigators identified 12 elders who appeared to know the risks, yet imposed the practice. However, many of these men themselves had cognitive limitations from prior consanguinity. How to assess the culpability of individuals who were both products and victims of the system? So 18s and 35 smar. After extensive deliberation, authorities focused on rescue and rehabilitation over punishment. Ezekiel Jackson and 2 other elders with full cognitive capacity were charged with crimes including child abuse and criminal negligence. The others were deemed unfit to stand trial due to their limitations. So 18s and 57 in January 1984, the difficult process of integrating community members into modern society began. For adults, especially the elderly, the transition was deeply traumatic. Many never fully adapted, spending their remaining years in specialized institutions, unable to process the world beyond the valley. For children, the prognosis was more promising, though still challenging. A 19 went seas. Those with preserved cognitive abilities showed surprising resilience. Mary Jackson, whose escape began it all, became an inspiring example. After intensive medical treatment and therapy, she completed high school and eventually became an advocate for people with genetic disabilities. As of 1939, the most severely affected children were placed in specialized institutions where they received medical care that, while unable to reverse deformities, significantly improved their quality of life. Surgical procedures corrected some malformations, and therapeutic interventions helped develop basic skills. The 2001 in 1985, the Jackson Foundation was established to coordinate ongoing care and support research on the rare genetic conditions observed. Genetic material from the family became a valuable global resource, helping identify genes associated with various rare conditions and contributing to predictive genetic test development. So 1934, the valley was transformed into a natural reserve with a small memorial honoring the hundreds of victims of an involuntary human experiment. The plaque bears a simple message: in memory of those who lived and died in isolation, and as a reminder of our collective responsibility to protect the most vulnerable. 2004-9. The Jackson case spurred significant policy changes regarding isolated communities. Several states implemented monitoring programs to identify at-risk groups, especially those with unconventional religious structures that could facilitate abuse, balancing religious freedom with the protection of vulnerable individuals, particularly children. For 2150 in genetics, the case renewed academic interest in consanguinity effects. Comparative studies with other historically isolated populations helped establish clearer parameters for risks associated with different degrees of kinship. So 2137 and 2003, 20 years after discovery, a documentary team located and interviewed 45 survivors. Their testimonies revealed diverse paths. Some had integrated fully into mainstream society, building families and careers. Others lived in assisted communities, requiring continuous support, and some remained institutionalized, their bodies and minds permanently marked by the involuntary genetic experiment. So 2158 Jacob Jackson, instrumental in exposing the elders' suppressed knowledge, became a geneticist dedicated to studying rare diseases. "What happened to my family cannot be undone," he declared at a 2010 medical conference. "But we can ensure these lives were not lost in vain. Each gene identified, each mechanism understood, each child saved from a condition we can now prevent or treat is a victory over the obscurantism that held my family captive for generations." So 2040 years, perhaps the most enduring legacy is awareness of consanguinity risk and the importance of genetic diversity for human health. In countries where cousin marriages remain culturally accepted, educational programs now include genetic risk information and offer premarital counseling and testing. So 2304, preserved genetic samples from the Jackson community continue to be a valuable research resource. In 2015, using modern sequencing technologies, scientists identified specific patterns of genetic deterioration across the 7 generations, providing unprecedented insight into how the human gene pool responds to extreme isolation. So 23728, the case of the Jackson family's 7 generations remains one of the most extreme and well-documented examples of prolonged consanguinity effects in humans. It is a story of isolation, control, and suffering, but also of resilience, scientific discovery, and, finally, redemption through knowledge. If you've watched until here, it's because you care about cases that mark families forever. So 23753, leave a comment saying, "I watched until here," so I can get to know you and see who really cares about the search for truth. Don't forget to like this video so it reaches more people. and share it with friends interested in real cases. If you're not yet subscribed, now is the ideal moment to join our community, unafraid to face humanity's most difficult truths. So 24/7 next week will bring another equally impactful case revealing how seemingly normal communities can hide disturbing secrets for decades. Until then, remember, truth, however painful, is always the first step toward healing.